higher wattage amplifiers versus lower wattage amplifiers. This is a question we get asked a lot, and I'm probably going to continue to go over it until we can make some kind of progress. And it's my fault. I'm probably not explaining it right. But anyway, this is from David in Israel. David writes, "Hi, Paul. Some say it's better to have a higher wattage amp working with a volume knob turned low, say 9 o'clock. And others claim it's better to have a lower wattage amp working with a volume knob turned high, say 12 o'clock, with all the same speakers, of course. Let's assume both amps are of the same good quality so that other factors are irrelevant." Well, that question boils down to gain setting on a device and whether you should push a low power amplifier because of the volume setting higher, or whether you should have the volume setting lower and don't push the higher power amplifier quite as hard. And I think there's a basic misunderstanding going on, probably one I've perpetrated or helped. And let's cover them separately. First off, when we talk about the idea of a volume control, and we prefer to have the volume control turned higher, I know that a number of you have gotten confused. Look, I've said this, and I've said this for years. Volume controls are like gas pedals, or we think of them as gas pedals, but they're more like brakes. And in a car, if you step on the gas too hard, you're going to stress the engine out, right? But a volume control is actually more like a brake, to where if you let your foot off the brake, so you don't attenuate so much, the car is much happier. And so we always want to have the volume control a bit higher as opposed to with the brakes on, and that's the analogy that I've used. That said, I think where I have erred is by not being more explicit in that what I am referring to only applies to potentiometers and passive devices to control volume. And perhaps that's just old geezer thinking, because today most new equipment doesn't really use potentiometers anymore. Back in the day, we used potentiometers, all we had, and if it had some kind of remote control, it had a motor on that potentiometer. So in those days, and with that equipment, if you have a stepped attenuator or you have a potentiometer, that potentiometer sounds better turned up than it does turned down. You have less resistance, there's less in the circuit, blah, blah, woof, woof. Cycle up to today, where we have our gain cell, like in our stellar gain cell DAC, whatever volume you're at is going to sound the same, because we're just varying the gain of the amplifier. Or in our BHK preamplifier, same thing. We are turning up the gain and lowering the gain of the amplifier, and it sounds pretty much the same regardless of where you have it. Of course, there's small differences, but there we're not going to apply that rule. All right, that's number one. Number two, and this is something I believe in another couple of videos, so stay tuned for it, I'm going to cover to a greater extent, which has to do with this idea that wattage and gain are different or the same, depending on how you're viewing all of this. So the wattage of an amplifier has almost nothing to do with the gain of the amplifier. And to keep this video short, like I like to do, I'm not going to get into that to a great extent. But I would just suggest that if you have the same level going into two and by level I mean the volume coming out of your preamplifier going into a power amplifier. Let's say you have 1 volt of level coming out of your preamplifier, and you put that 1 volt into 2 amplifiers, a powerful one and a not powerful one. And both are, as he says here, as David says, they're of the same quality and kind of the same sort of design principles, meaning they have the same gain, then you'll get the same loudness regardless of whether it's a high power amp or a low power amp. No difference. None. The only difference is going to be whether or not you have headroom, whether or not you're working at the top of this amplifier's capabilities or at the bottom of the amplifier's capabilities. The volume will be identical. And so there the advice is always go for headroom. There's no advantage in pushing an amplifier beyond its linear limits. Always go for the more powerful amp if you can afford it. Okay, hope that helps. Thanks, David. I'll talk to everybody tomorrow. Bye.